right, so what is milk? Let's start with that. And milk is obviously what mammals use to feed their young. It's a collection of proteins and fat and a few minerals in water that can deliver nutrition very quickly and very digestibly to a young mammal. And in this case, what milk we're using for cheese tends to be cow, sheep, goat milk, sometimes water buffalo milk here in Maine. And it's something that we get every day from a lactating mammal and then consume either as fluid or then as processed into cheese, yogurt, etc. Here in Maine, we're incredibly lucky to be able to access raw milk in a licensed manner. And being licensed here in Maine means having your milk tested a number of times through the year to make sure that your sanitation processes are perfect, essentially. And once you're licensed, you're able to bottle up that milk right out of the animal, chill it down to refrigerated temperature, and send it to a store and to be sold or sell it off your farm. But it's so great, and we're so lucky to have access to this perfectly excellent, high-quality milk from small dairies. The milk we have access to, the raw milk, also tends to be unhomogenized, which is perfect for making cheese. So I just want to encourage anyone who has access to milk like this to really consider making yogurt or cheese from it, because it does wonderful things. Pasteurized milk is also good for cheese making. It does change the chemistry of it, but as long as you understand how that happens, it's perfectly good to work with that. You can also do something called heat treatment because it's just the same heating and cooling as would be done with pasteurization, except you're not doing it with a special measured 3 temperatures being measured at the same time and recorded mostly on a paper disc, but you're just heating the milk up generally to 145 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes, and then after 30 minutes you can cool it and begin working with it, and that's considered the equivalent of pasteurization. And that's excellent for small-scale cheese making. Generally, in a milk processing plant, they're heating the milk up to 165 degrees, and they only have to hold it there for 15 seconds for it to be considered pasteurized. In the process of looking for sources for your milk, you want to look for unhomogenized milk that is either licensed and raw or pasteurized but unhomogenized, and begin to work with it from there. The second ingredient in cheese and yogurt is cultures, and these are important. It's a family of bacteria that eat lactose that is found, it's a sugar commonly found in milk, and they create lactic acid as a result of metabolizing that sugar. And that acidification is what coagulates yogurt and gives all the different qualities to cheeses that happen to be renneted before the cultures really take over the acidification. And when you're making cheese, you have to understand there's really 2 different families of those cultures. One's called thermophilic, and that word itself means heat-loving, and it makes sense because this class of bacteria, lactic bacteria, are most comfortable from about 95 degrees Fahrenheit to 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The second class of cheese cultures are called mesophilic, and that really means they love that middle temperatures. And they are most comfortable from about 75 degrees Fahrenheit to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. It's actually easy to access both kinds of cultures, even if you aren't ordering them freeze-dried from a cheese supply website or store. If you wanted to make a cheese that was thermophilic, you could start with a live culture yogurt, because yogurt has the predominant thermophilic cultures already inside of it. If you wanted to make a mesophilic type cheese, you could start with a cultured buttermilk, which also uses those types of cultures in the culturing of the buttermilk. Kefir grains have also been used, and grains are actually a combination of about 20 or 30 different cultures, and they include mesophilic and thermophilic cultures in those grains. So it is possible to make cheese of either type using kefir grains, and then you essentially select the type you're using by the temperature you begin making your cheese at. Another critical component to cheese is acid. So why is this important? And it's important because it helps preserve this milk, because fewer bacteria enjoy living in an acidic environment. And by digesting lactose and creating lactic acid, those lactic bacteria, which are harmless to us, then create the cheese as a lower lower pH or a higher acid thing. And so I need to talk a little bit about pH and what it is. If you remember from science class, pH 7 is water, which is essentially neutral. And then when you add acid, it goes lower, the pH scale goes lower. And when you add a basic material, it goes higher. From 0 to 7 is acid, from 7 to 14 is basic. But we are always in the acid realm when we're talking about milk and cheese and processed dairy products. And there's a couple different ways to know where you are acidically, because it is important for many different cheeses as to when to stop the bacterial activity using salt. You want to stop that activity at the proper acid level to get the desired temperature or the texture or flavor in that cheese. In the old days, before they had a general understanding of acidity, what they would do is test the curd, and it turns out cheese curds will stretch at a very specific acidic point. It's at between 5.0 and 5.3 on the pH scale. When you make in the old days, when they made cheddar, they'd actually heat an iron brand up to red hot, and then take that curd and touch it to the red hot iron where it would stick, and then they could stretch off the iron, and if it stretched and had nice fluid stretch to it, that would mean they were at 5.2, 5.0, and that would tell them what to do next in the cheddar make. The same thing applies for mozzarella. You heat up the curd for mozzarella, and if it stretches instead of breakings when you pull it apart, then you're at that right level where you can then begin stretching your mozzarella or your provolone and making the different shapes that those types of cheeses come in. And acid development coincides with all the other bacterial activity that's going on, because those bacteria are not just making lactic acid, they're also making gas in some cases, which is how you get the eyes in Swiss cheese, and also the veining in blue cheeses is because you have left gaps internally in the cheese. So some of the cultures that you might want to use also make gas. They're also digesting other things, and that's creating lots of different flavors. Think, why does a Swiss cheese taste very nutty and have that sort of rich flavor that's very different from a cheddar? And that's because those bacteria are producing that nutty flavor, whereas the bacteria used for cheddar making are not. So that's where you start choosing and selecting which bacteria you want to use for your cheese, because different bacteria make different flavors. The essence of cheese making is to foster the ideal environment for bacterial growth, because you need those cheese cultures to do much of the work of acid production, which leads to flavor creation and also leads to the preservation of that cheese. Acid production also helps curds shrink and therefore lose moisture, and moisture loss is definitely a component of cheese making. And if you want your cheese to age for a long time, you really need to create a great bit of moisture loss. So you're creating this acid because you have cultures that are using the food that's available in this milk to grow, but unfortunately, this creates an ideal environment at the ideal temperature for foodborne pathogens as well. So sanitation during cheese making is incredibly important, because you are working with a class of bacteria that is actually nutritious for us, but you're creating an environment for other bacteria that can harm us and even kill us sometimes. So if you use well water, for example, definitely have it tested for coliform. You want to make sure that it tests clean, and that's your first step for successful and safe cheese making. So the biggest question I get as a cheesemaker from anyone when I talk about what I do is, what is rennet? And rennet's obviously a really important part of cheesemaking because it allows for the great variety of different cheeses we now have versus the sort of very similar cheeses that happen when you drain yogurt or chev curd. You're starting with a very highly acid, high moisture curd when you're depending on that acid to do the coagulating. Rennet allows you to coagulate first and acidify later. How did we discover it? Well, if you happen to be slaughtering a young animal that is a cow, a sheep, a goat, or some other ruminant, you immediately are aware that there's this very complex and different digestion system in that animal. And it turns out the fourth stomach in that very complex digestion system that is meant to ferment grass for food, the fourth stomach is just this little swelling along the digestion system. And when you open that up, if the animal had been milking or nursing recently before it was slaughtered, you will discover cheese in there. And that's because that fourth stomach produces rennet. And it does that because that grass fermenting digestive system can't digest milk because it's a totally different material, but at the same time, this ruminant baby needs to get nutrition from its mother, and it gets that from milk. And having the rennet in the last stomach there get that milk coagulated allows that digestive system to get all the nutrition it needs from the milk that it's been drinking until they can get their grass fermenting digestive system fired up and working. But that takes a couple of months. So in the meantime, the baby calf, the baby kid, the baby lamb is getting all its nutrition by drinking milk. It's coagulating in that fourth stomach, and then it's able to digest it. So way back when, somebody figured this out, and if you harvest that little swelling on a baby calf, you can then salt it and preserve it as you would any other meat. But then when the cheesemaker is ready to get the enzymes, you take that, it's called a vel, V-E-L, a salted fourth stomach, and you soak that in salt water, and that salt water now contains the rennet that if you just add a few drops into your batch of cheese, will end up coagulating that cheese and allowing you the ability to control the acid production because you've already gotten the coagulation needed to begin the process of draining water from that curd. So that's traditional rennet. Very few cheeses use traditional rennet. Most rennet today is produced with modern GMO bacteria that have spliced into them the exact DNA that creates a rennet molecule, and then those bacteria are propagated and rennet is produced and separated from the bacteria, and then that rennet is chemically identical to the rennet found in a ruminant's fourth stomach. However, when you use traditional rennet, you get traces of other different enzymes beyond chymosin, which is the word for that rennet enzyme. And that adds a little extra variety to cheeses that are made with traditional rennet. The GMO rennet is pure and works exactly the same way, but it also lacks the variability when you're using traditional rennet. The other factor with rennet is that it's often shipped in a concentrated form. Either it's called double, which is half the volume for the same activity, or triple sometimes activity. Whereas traditional rennet is always a single rennet. And that's important to know when you're cheese making because it determines how much rennet you need to use to get the same coagulation in the same amount of time that you want. So you always need to pay attention to whether you have single, double, or even triple concentrated rennet. One of the last ingredients or important components of cheese is salt. And now salt helps a cheesemaker lessen the bacterial action. When you add salt to the lactic bacteria, they will slow down their growth. And if you add enough salt to the curd, it will actually kill off all the lactic bacteria that have been producing acid for you. So it's really a way to stop acid production, but it also creates a different environment, creates a less bacterial active for any bacteria. So again, it preserves the cheese, and it also helps draw out more of the water that's in those curds. And depending on the cheese you're making, you may be salting because you're actually wanting to create a much drier curd. And so it's really important to use salt in cheese making. And then what kind of salt is also important. Different salts have different uses in cheese making. A chunky salt like a kosher salt or a diamond crystal salt is really good if you're dry salting your curd. So that means you're forming the cheese wheel before you're adding the salt, and then you just rub salt all over the sides and the top and the bottom, and those sharp shapes will help it stick to the outside and then be drawn into the cheese wheel and begin getting through the whole entire cheese so that it maintains a consistent salt level. Fine salt, as you can imagine, would be drawn in very quickly, but actually when you're using it on a wet curd, if it's drawn in too quickly, you actually create a skin around the curd because the outside immediately gets very stiff and loses its moisture very fast, and it does not help the salt be drawn all the way into the middle of the cheese, and you want that salt to go all the way through it and become uniform throughout the cheese wheel. So the other side of it is you can brine your cheeses to get the salt in, and that means dunking them into water that has a whole bunch of salt in it, and then just by diffusion, the salt from the brine enters the cheese wheel, and then the water from the cheese wheel enters the brine. And that's actually a very common way to salt, especially large wheels of cheese, because it does it very evenly and very effectively. So just pick your salt by what format it's in, and then where it's from, and what has been added to it. And generally I find a pickling salt, which is literally pure sodium chloride, is the way to go. But everyone has their preferences, and many cheesemakers really enjoy working with the main sea salt that's produced here, and it just provides another element of provenance to their cheeses, and they don't find any problems down the road with aging. So that's great. The question I often get from beginning cheesemakers is, what do I do with all this whey? There's actually a lot you can do. First of all, you can make ricotta, and ricotta, the Italian word ricotta, means re-cooked. And what that really refers to is you cook the cheese, cook the curds to make the cheese and the whey, then you remove the curds and you re-cook that whey to coagulate the rest of the proteins that are in that whey and turn that into the cheese we call ricotta, which is essentially all those other proteins other than casein that are now coagulated into a white mass. It generally makes a very nice, rich, sort of gentle cheese. It's high moisture, and you can drain it and salt it and then begin to age ricotta. And then also some ricotta makers will actually add a little milk back to the whey before they make their ricotta, which richens it up and especially adds a lot more milk fat to it, which means an extra rich batch of ricotta. While you're making cheese, one of the important materials you're going to be using is cheesecloth. Now, this is really important to understand because there's something called cheesecloth that's sold at supermarkets and hardware stores and otherwhere, and I think everybody knows what it looks like. It's a very loose weave material, tends to be white cotton, and it is totally useless when you're making actually cheese. What you want to use as cheesecloth, which is an important component, for draining those curds is a muslin type cloth. It's a much more closely woven together. Ideally, if you can get it unbleached, but bleached muslin is fine. I have used in the past baby diapers that are brand new, never used as diapers, but it's the correct weave, and it also comes in a nice size square to make a large wheel of cheese, or if you're making smaller cheeses, I can cut it into quarters and then hem those cut sides, and it's a perfect, makes 4 perfect small wheel size cheesecloths. And this tighter weave is important in cheese making because when you're draining your curds, the cloth itself touches the side of the curds, and the fibers in the fabric will actually wick moisture out of the cheese as it's being pressed and drained. And that is a great thing when you're pressing and draining, because there's the danger of creating this impervious surface if you pressed, for example, against just plastic, curd to plastic. So the cheesecloth is an important barrier between that and helps with the draining. Why in the end do we age most cheeses? Well, as we've found, I'm sure you've experienced, fresh cheeses are very tasty. But it turns out, across the board, the fresh cheeses generally taste like the milk that they were made from, because they are very close to what that milk was when it was first coagulated and turned into cheese. But in order to get all the other kinds of flavors that we know are available through cheese, that has to be done through breakdown of the proteins. Cheese is mostly protein, and that protein is mostly a very large molecule called casein. And casein itself, doesn't really have a flavor, except it is the flavor of milk. And when casein is coagulated, it traps the butter fat that's also in milk. That is satisfying, but tends to be a bit bland, especially compared to a lot of the cheeses we're aware of that are aged. What happens through aging is that by the introduction of lactic bacteria, you're also introducing a whole bunch of other enzymes that will be available in that cheese once the bacteria die to continue breaking down enzymes in that cheese. So you've got this giant casein protein, and now you've got a lot of, it's now sort of surrounded by all these different enzymes, and those enzymes are breaking that giant protein into smaller and smaller pieces. And what those smaller pieces are is just segments of the casein that become their own proteins and their own molecules, and they all have their own aromas and their own flavors. And as you age, you're breaking the large protein into smaller and smaller bits, and those smaller bits are then being broken into even tinier bits, and all of that is contributing all those different kinds of flavors. And at the same time, some of your aging materials will be breaking down the butterfat, and the same principle applies. The butterfat is this very long glycerin and other molecules, and those enzymes then start chopping that up and then start chopping the smaller pieces up, and they turn into their own flavors. So what we get from aging cheese is more and more flavors in a controlled environment. A lot of what I've just talked about is aging just inside the cheese, and a lot of cheese is wrapped so that there's nothing else can grow on that cheese as it's aging, and so the only effect is those enzymes from the lactic bacteria that had initially been used for acidifying the curd. But if you don't wrap or wax a cheese, naturally that surface is a very attractive area for other things to grow, primarily molds, and there are several molds that cheesemakers use to create more aging effects. And you can think of a camembert or a brie, and it's that white surface, and that white is from a mold called Penicillium camberti that grows on the surface but also puts roots down into the curd. Those roots exude other enzymes that then break down the protein in a very specific way to make that nice creamy interior with all those typical brie and camembert flavors. But there are other molds that grow on the surface and do similar things but with different effects and different flavors. Now, you also are aware of the mold for blue cheese, which is called Penicillium roqueforti, and that will grow on the surface as well, but it's most effective when it grows interior of the cheese, and that's created when you actually put holes in a wheel of cheese to make sure that oxygen can get inside the cheese. You'll have made your cheese wheel with little crevices and holes in that curd. And when the oxygen reaches those crevices, the blue mold has already been introduced to the milk, so it's all over the cheese. And where there's oxygen, the blue mold will grow. And so you can see in a cut of blue cheese where that mold has grown. And the mold can only grow where the oxygen is, and the oxygen is introduced by poking holes in that wheel, but then letting it age. And blue mold tends to metabolize fats more than it does protein, and that is one of the reasons that it has that very distinctive flavor that people either love or they can't stand. But blue mold, obviously a very famous way to get both surface effects but interior effects. Now, all of these are controlled by salting and the moisture that you leave in the curd. And other surface effects can be accessed by using surface bacteria that are very comfortable in salt, whereas most bacteria is not. And these surface bacteria that love salt tend to be this red bacteria called Brevibacterium linens, or B linens is often referred to, and they create that very distinctive red or orange surface, which tends to be wet because you encourage its growth by regularly rubbing the edge surface of your cheeses with salt water to make sure that other molds are not getting in there, and also encouraging the growth of this salt-loving bacteria. So all of these aging effects happen based on the moisture level of the curd that we're working with, and that moisture level has been determined by the cheesemaker in the pod, essentially, by how much acid they've allowed to be produced, how much salt they've put onto the curd, for how long, if they've pressed that curd to even draw out more moisture. All of that contributes to what is the end result of your internal aging of the enzymes working, the natural enzymes from the lactobacteria working on the curd, and then the external aging, which is introducing surface effects or introducing molds internally or on the exterior of the cheese. So just a quick thought is, if you want to age a cheese for a long time, you need to get it the curd as dry as possible. And if you would like a faster aging cheese, you need to have a very high moisture curd. So that's the very beginning of that. But then you also need to be able to control the rind, because you may or may not want mold growth. Now, in the development of British hard cheese, for example, cheddar, what they did not want the mold to affect the internal cheese, but before the age of plastic wrap, which is what's used now, they would wrap their cheddar wheels in linen that was then coated with lard. And that created, for the most part, an impermeable surface around the surface of the cheese that it didn't 100% eliminate the growth of mold, but it reduced it a great deal. And so your traditional cheddars have that linen or cloth wrapping that's then rubbed with lard or another material that blocks that cloth and blocks the air from going into that. And just understand that if you're doing that, or you're wrapping it in plastic, or you're waxing the cheese, because that was another common treatment to close off the surface from any surface effects. The waxing is generally more suited for smaller wheels than the big giant cheddar wheels, but if you're creating that impervious surface, the only aging you're going to get is from the internal enzymes, and that's desirable in those cheese types. But other cheese types that aren't being wrapped, or there was no easy access to a lot of linen and lard, for example, the Alpine cheeses, they would actually create an impervious surface using salt. So after they'd gotten the proper moisture for the cheese, they would then rub a great deal of salt around each cheese every day or every couple of days, and then essentially that would dry out that exterior of the cheese wheel so much that it would then be less of a desirable place for molds or other surface agents to grow, and thus they could control the surface just using an excess of salt. And often during that process, because the B. linens is a salt-loving bacteria, the B. linens would grow for a little bit until the rind dried out completely. So a lot of the traditional Alpine cheeses, you'll note, have this yellow, orange, or red cast to them, and that's from the beginning effects of the Brevibacterium, but then they are stopped by the excessive use of salt at that point. So I've been talking for a long time, and it's just because there is so much information here, and I've only touched on a lot of different things that I encourage you to explore. Cheese is fascinating and amazing and so complex when you think about it, and it's just 4 different ingredients. So I've tried to give you an overview. I also made some videos that will help you get started making cheese, and I hope you go ahead and do that. This has been Cheesy. Thank you for listening.